Putin painted a picture of horror, but the response he received was even more terrifying, much faster, and far more humiliating. Putin launched a brutal attack on Kiev on November 13th. Within just a few hours on the night of November 14th, Ukrainian missiles turned the port of Novorossiysk into a scene of hell. The scale of this attack was so catastrophic that the Russian governor was forced to declare a state of emergency in the city. Turkish sailors at the port captured those hellish moments, lighting up the entire night sky. Now, this will be a controversial topic, and such controversial subjects are often suppressed by algorithms, but you can break that by hitting like. Thank you. The attack lasted for an entire hour. They attacked the oil refinery, they attacked the ship, they attacked the refinery again. The comments on social media were clear, very beautiful. The S-400 system, which protected the port, the warehouses in the port, the gas stations, and the docks, was destroyed. Ukraine leveled them using a combination of Neptune missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers and drones. And the confirmation came from the highest level, directly from President Zelensky. This was the first major strike from Ukraine's Pride, the domestically developed long Neptune cruise missile with a range of 1,000 kilometers. The Russians had blindly relied on 12 S-400 Triumph missile launchers they had stockpiled at the port. On the night of November 14th, Ukraine's first wave of attacks did not target the port itself, but rather its eyes and shield protecting it. As President Zelensky confirmed, domestically produced long Neptune cruise missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers were launched. The target, the S-300 and S-400 systems, considered impregnable, of the 1537th Cossack Kuban anti-aircraft missile regiment. The air defense systems fell into a state of panic, firing aimlessly into the sky, unsure of what they were targeting. And then immediately after, silence, followed by a massive secondary explosion. The shield had collapsed. The Alpha unit of Ukraine's security service, SBU, set an exceptionally well-executed trap. First, suicide UAVs like the FP-1 and FP-2 were launched as decoys. The goal was not to destroy the launchers, but to force the very expensive S-400 radar systems to activate, become jammed, and get caught up in tracking these targets. While the Russian air defense operators were distracted, locking onto these cheap targets, the real strike, low-flying, highly maneuverable long Neptune missiles, arrived. The moment the shield was broken, Phase 2 of the operation began immediately. The Russian Ministry of Defense later issued a statement. We shot down 66 UAVs in the Krasnodar region. That may be true, but it does not change the fact that the main force hit its target. Now their attention shifted to the unprotected Central Economic Region. The primary target, the Shestkaris oil station, owned by the Russian state monopoly, Transneft. The oil storage tanks, critical pumping facilities, and the docks where the massive oil tankers were anchored, were attacked one by one. Hours after the attack, the Russian state monopoly, Transneft, was forced to issue an official statement. All operations at the port of Novorossiysk had been suspended. This meant that 20% of Russia's seaborne oil exports were halted overnight. It also meant a 2% disruption in the global oil supply. As news of the attack spread, global Brent oil prices immediately surged by 2% to 3%. Putin needed this oil to fund the war he had initiated in Ukraine. Now, oil was burning right in his own port. This meant that the flow of money into Putin's war chest was cut off overnight. As we mentioned earlier, the retaliatory fire in Novorossiysk didn't just burn Russia's oil. Putin's impotence also struck a blow to his ally, Kazakhstan. The attack also forced the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, CPC, oil export terminal located right next to it to temporarily cease operations. Putin has now become an unreliable partner, no longer capable of protecting his allies, even holding their economies hostage to fuel his own war. And at that moment, another blow came from the east. Japan announced strong sanctions, coordinated with Ukraine, targeting Russia's shadow fleet used to secretly transport oil from ports like Novorossiysk. This is a nightmare scenario for Putin. While Ukraine destroys Putin's oil bridge in Novorossiysk through military action, economic powers like Japan are sinking, legally speaking, the oil tankers of Russia's shadow fleet used to circumvent sanctions. Putin has become such a risky partner that even customers like China have been forced to increase imports from Saudi Arabia to make up for the oil shortfall from Russia. But there is an even more painful aspect than the economic one: the human aspect. The foundation of Putin's propaganda has always been the promise of stability and security. But there's an even more painful aspect than the economic impact: the human aspect. The core of Putin's propaganda has always been the promise of stability and security. On the night of November 14th, The contract of stability Putin promised exploded right in front of the people of Novorossiysk. The port city, once thought to be impregnable, the place where the Crimea fleet sought refuge and where Russia's elite vacationed, had turned into a war zone overnight. The panic was so great that Governor Veniamin Kondratyev could not control the situation and was forced to declare a state of emergency in the city. The war had knocked on Russia's door. According to official figures, at least 4 apartment buildings and 2 private homes were damaged. Crew members aboard a civilian ship in the port were injured. And now we come to the clearest image of betrayal. Military Unit Number 52,522. Many independent sources have confirmed that this was a massive ammunition depot. So, where is this depot located? Right in the middle of a residential area, next to schools and apartment buildings. When this depot exploded, the fireball that erupted showed the whole world how Putin had placed his own people in danger, how he used them as human shields. The Russian people are paying the price for Putin's war, not only with empty wallets but now with their very lives. Putin has not protected the Russian people. He is throwing them into the flames to preserve his own power. That night, Putin also shot himself in the foot by causing Kazakhstan's oil export route, a fellow ally, to be cut off due to Russia's weak ability to defend its ports. And while all of this is unfolding, Putin is losing on another front. Just a few days before, Japan, an economic partner, announced new and significant sanctions targeting the Shadow Fleet, the force that helps Russia secretly transport oil through ports like Novorossiysk. The attack on Novorossiysk, a military humiliation and economic loss, has thrown the Kremlin into a state of complete panic. Because this attack highlighted the fragility of Putin's strategic deadlock, they are not only losing externally, on the battlefield, but even within Russia, they cannot protect their most strategic assets, not even with the S-400 systems considered impregnable. And this situation has triggered the Kremlin's greatest fear. They have run out of soldiers. There is no manpower left. The general panic and mobilization the Kremlin is experiencing is a direct consequence of this strategic deadlock. Ukraine's increasingly effective attacks on critical points like the port of Novorossiysk and Russian oil refineries have forced Putin to make an unavoidable choice. He has been compelled to withdraw elite units, which were already in short supply, to defend strategic facilities, especially oil refineries. This redeployment, combined with significant battlefield losses, has turned the manpower shortage in the Russian military from a crisis into a catastrophe. Putin is desperately in need of a large-scale mobilization to fill the gaps on the front lines and protect domestic facilities. However, he has not forgotten the great humiliation of 2022, when he declared a partial mobilization, leading to hundreds of thousands of educated men fleeing the country, causing a brain drain in Russia. This time, he cannot afford a repeat of such insecurity. Therefore, to prevent mass escape, Putin resorted to digital measures, blocking the number of those called up from leaving the borders through the Gosuslugi portal and FSB databases. This is no longer just a brain drain. It is a far more dangerous form of brain lock, as skilled engineers and workers who cannot flee will choose to hide instead of going to the front lines, crippling Russia's war economy from within. By closing off the escape routes, Putin has sparked a social explosion. And when even this brain lock measure wasn't enough, Putin resorted to an even more tragic plan. Just a few weeks ago, he announced an excellent plan to counter Ukraine's attacks on the oil refineries. What was that plan? The plan was to protect the oil refineries with reserve soldiers and veterans. But this is truly ridiculous. On the night of November 14th, when Ukraine fired long Neptune missiles from 1,000 kilometers away targeting the S-400 systems, Putin intended to deploy 60-year-old veterans against that modern technology? Putin's crisis is not just about manpower. The real crisis lies in fuel, the lifeblood of war. The destruction of the massive oil station in Novorossiysk was a knife plunged into Russia's already bleeding fuel wound. Ukraine's year-long campaign targeting oil refineries has thrown Russia's domestic fuel market into chaos. Putin's energy superpower now cannot even find enough oil for its cars, tanks, or even its farmers. And this desperation has forced them to knock on the door of their last ally, Belarus. According to data verified by industry sources, Belarus exported 49,000 tons of gasoline and 33,000 tons of diesel to Russia in September. These figures are a blow compared to previous months. However, this volume is actually quite small in comparison to Russia's massive demand. On a typical month, Russia consumes over 3 million tons of gasoline. In other words, the 49,000 tons of relief from Belarus only meets 1.6% of the country's monthly needs. It's like applying a Band-Aid to a patient bleeding heavily. While the reserves in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg may be sufficient temporarily, the crisis is beginning to spread across the vast geography of Russia, from the Ural Mountains in the east to Siberia, and from the southern agricultural regions to the Far East. Initially, the Kremlin sought a solution by banning the export of gasoline and diesel to other countries to prioritize the domestic market. This was an unprecedented panic move, meaning they gave up vital foreign currency revenue for the war budget. But even this was not enough to stop the internal bleeding. Prices skyrocketed, the black market emerged, and eventually, regional authorities were forced to implement desperate measures reminiscent of the Soviet era, such as sales restrictions and price freezes. Oil tankers from Belarus began entering Russian territory, becoming the most concrete evidence of this monumental failure, the systemic collapse. But even that did not solve Russia's oil crisis. Another chapter in Russia's total systemic collapse was recorded in flames and twisted metal on September 25, 2025, near Smolensk, a key western gateway to Russia. On that day, a fuel train, seen as the last hope to alleviate the fuel crisis for Moscow, collided with a truck at a railroad crossing, derailed, and caught fire intensely. This disaster was not only the loss of 12 tank cars carrying oil and their valuable cargo, but also a humiliating testimony to a superpower that could not even maintain basic logistics functions in times of crisis. It exposed the decaying infrastructure and Russia's war machine's inability to sustain itself when needed. Although Russian state media portrayed the incident as a mere accident, in the context of war, the lack of basic security measures on the strategically important Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow railway line was a serious failure. This accident paralyzed the railway line between Belarus and Russia for several hours, disrupting not only fuel transportation but also the supply of food, military, and civilian goods passing through this route. Furthermore, the incident highlighted a significant gap in Russia's western logistics corridor. If another accident or sabotage were to occur, the entire supply chain to the front lines could be crippled. Putin's last hope vanished on a broken railroad crossing. And what burned in Smolensk that night was not just a train, but the propaganda face of the Kremlin's "everything is under control" narrative. The strategic shock caused by tens of thousands of tons of gasoline from Belarus was even greater than its actual volume. These shipments were not only emergency logistical support, but also the clearest sign of the deepening cracks in Russia's internal system. Cracks that can no longer be concealed. The ripple effect of this crisis is now hitting the place the Kremlin fears most: the daily lives of ordinary Russians, their patience, and their tacit commitment to the regime. Putin's 20-year social contract with the Russian people has always been based on a simple equation: give me politics, and I will bring order, stability, and a predictable standard of living. The fuel crisis is tearing this contract apart before the eyes of millions. Stability has now evaporated into the kilometers-long queues at gas stations. Order is being undermined by the anger of drivers struggling for fuel, black market touts shouting exorbitant prices per liter, and farmers staring at empty shelves. The first and hardest hit sector is Russia's agriculture. The crisis erupted at the most critical time of the harvest season. From Krasnodar to Rostov, the southern regions known as Russia's breadbasket, farmers no longer have diesel to run their tractors and harvesters. This is not just an agricultural crisis, but the beginning of a potential food security disaster. Unharvested wheat will affect bread prices in the coming months, and unshipped fruits and vegetables will leave supermarket shelves empty in major cities. This is the clearest example of how logistics paralysis can turn into domestic scarcity and chaos. Secondly, this crisis has placed the Kremlin in a dilemma. Military analysts have started to question, and it is being debated in the general headquarters, where will the scarce fuel be prioritized? For the massive diesel reserves needed to keep tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery on the Ukrainian front moving? Or will it be diverted to domestic gas stations to prevent panic and a potential social explosion? If fuel is prioritized for the military, urban chaos will escalate, and Putin's power may be questioned by the people. But if the fuel is allocated to civilians, the mobility of Russian troops on the front lines will be severely restricted, turning them into easy targets. Both options carry the potential for disaster. If fuel is prioritized for the military, urban chaos will intensify, and Putin's authority will be undermined by his own people. If fuel is prioritized for civilians, it will drastically reduce the mobility of Russian forces on the front lines, turning them into vulnerable targets, opening up new opportunities for Ukraine to strike. Both options carry the potential for catastrophe. This demonstrates just how sophisticated Ukraine's strategy is. They are not just attacking an oil refinery, they are forcing the Kremlin to choose between its people and its military. The war has now come right back to Russia's home, to its safest port, leaving Putin with nowhere to hide. This is the collapse of Putin's oil fortress, and merely a precursor to a much larger collapse to come.